excited to have Frank Cuiuli here with us. Did I pronounce your name right?
That perfect.
Very good. Been wanting to get you on this little podcast for ages because we've heard of your experiences with a thing called holacracy.
Holacracy?
It's spelt
Holacracy?
spelt holacracy for people who want to look it up, which I would describe as an alternative management model to business. Is that the way you would look at it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just another way of running the operation, governing the operation.
Yeah, cool. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your company, and then I'll ask you a couple of other questions in terms of how you came across Holacracy.
Yeah, so 8 Squad is just it's a Salesforce.com implementation partner in essence, but really, I mean, the business is about helping customers through, digital transformation, leveraging the capability of technology. We try to take a very human-centered approach to, anything we do from a technology transformation perspective. And but really that's I classify that as what the company does. It's not the why that drives the business, one of the core principles of 8 Squad that we were trying to kind of lean into was how do we break kind of how companies are run, to do it differently, right? To get rid of kind of linear power hierarchy that typically exists in most companies. And how do we put in a human development framework that really focuses on building the individual, not as an asset that the company uses. It's the typical, not just looking at building skills, but building the person holistically, right? Because fundamentally, I believe if you equip people to deal with the stresses of life better, they show up better. And that means they deliver better outcomes to your customer. So those two things were kind of cornerstone principles that really is what I classify the stuff that we love. That's the fun part of the business. The why, the what we do could be anything. We wanted to create something that does things differently, and that's pretty much what 8 Squad's about.
Very cool. The reason I asked that, I would describe it as a company with traditional goals, right? So it's not I've run a lifestyle business myself, which is why I was interested in alternative models. I was more interested in the individuals, the employees in the company than I was in the one shareholder's value. And I hear echoes of that in what you're describing. But it's it's a traditional business with, I guess an exit one day as a potential. It's got investors.
Yep.
How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, that's a good question. We still have to run to the principles of, what a traditional business has to run by, right? We've got shareholders. I've got an external board who are the majority shareholders. They have expectations of profit and returns. But the two things can coexist. And you do have to have shareholders that also buy in on a vision. And I think when I was brought in to build this and take over and expand it and grow it, that was a non-negotiable for me. I wanted to do it differently. I wanted to, I had to have that freedom to lean in, and provided I can meet the metrics that they wanted as a group of investors, and they had no problem. But the interesting thing is, even in tough times, right, that tests everything. The conditions of the market have been tough, right? So you're not necessarily always hitting those financial performance metrics, right? But again, you can still balance decisions that honour the initial conditions of what you started something, and they're just business decisions you've got to make, and it's never perfect, but ultimately I had a good board that was still very supportive, that they've seen the difference of leaning into that whole human-centered, human development philosophy has delivered, and they've allowed me to stay pretty committed to that.
What are those benefits they've seen?
You need to move towards the microphone when you talk.
What are those benefits?
Look, so I think, firstly, talent attraction. We scaled very fast, right? And I think it was very clear that, we were able to attract good people in a very competitive people. They can see that, and they might not be able to put their finger on that thing, but they can sense it, they can see it, yeah? But then, you also see that applying these philosophies and these methods, the real tangible benefits it has when you have to take people out of struggle street and turn them around, because things are always going to go wrong. We've got projects going wrong. You've got all sorts of things happening on a, day-to-day basis, and our approach to turning those things around is quite unique and different. And they see the result of that, right? So, can you translate that down to what that means to a bottom line, right? I think that'd be hard, especially under the extraordinary conditions of the past kind of number of years, right? We've just had one crisis after another to deal with, right? I think if you really want to answer that, you got to look at, well, how have other companies performed, and what's been the impact on them? Are they still around? Do they go backwards? Do they go forwards? And maybe then you can probably say, well, is what we're doing better or worse, right? But either way, I think we've been able to, because of these things, sustain, right, hold, and put ourselves in a pretty good position to, as conditions change in the market, take advantage.
You mentioned that you joined the business after it was already there.
Kind of. The board essentially bought a small company, and it was like 15 people, and that was kind of just a platform, right? It had revenue, it had some people, it had some skills, which we essentially pulled that business apart, remodeled, and relaunched. So then that's when they put me into then take that, do the transformation, and launch the business. So we're now circa 100 people, right? There's no remnants of that business now, right? So it was just a platform to launch something new.
The reason I ask the question is that I've found when I'm trying to change the culture of something, it can sometimes be harder than starting fresh. Did you have some of those challenges, or was the group small enough that you could?
No, 100%. You still have, 15, 20 people that you got to convince them we're going on a different journey, right? That takes time. You've got to break apart current ways of doing things, move it to a new way of doing things. Like, it took a good year just to establish a new baseline to move forward from. And even then, the models then that we moved forward with, we tested, broke them, back to the drawing board, right? So the first 2 years were just about refining the model and testing the theories and refining the model. And then getting, and kind of where we are now is the result of some of those big decisions we made, which have now matured, and where I can honestly say, like, we're seeing the benefits of those decisions.
You also mentioned that the board has seen some benefit, and you've talked about the fact that that's not necessarily okay. It's a number. Can you sum that up in like a couple of words? Like, what is for you the commercial benefit for management, for the board of running this model?
Oh, look, I won't put it down just to the model, right? But we grew double, triple digit for the first 3 years straight amongst the market that was quite competitive. We had COVID, we had a whole bunch of things, right? We literally, COVID hit like 6 months after we launched the business. We had to attract talent where talent was exiting the market, because you had people couldn't get into the country, you had all the visa issues, so you had a diminishing talent pool. You had turbulent market conditions and a new brand, new startup, high risk, from an employee perspective. Yet we were able to, go from 15 to 100, and you think about how many people you have to hire. It's not just the new heads, it's the churn of, people come and maybe it's not for them and go and you got to replace them. So, I think the fact that we're able to achieve those results is by a big part because of the unique model, because of the things that we're doing that were different and unique, because that's what attracted people to us over other companies that, were also heavy in market. And I think the model allowed us to be nimble and make decisions fast and not everything, rely on me, as the CEO with the title, that's the problem. I think that a lot of people, especially if you're going to scale fast, like, a lot of founders, a lot of entrepreneurs are the driving force behind their business, but they become the linchpin as well.
Yep.
So, we tried to engineer that out from the very beginning, right? So, and I think that in a big way has helped us because it empowers people to make calls, to make decisions.
So there's obviously a talent acquisition side of that, which is, okay, people are attracted to a business that's not command and conquer. And it sounds like you're also saying, I guess, a combination of resilience and a genuine agility. I don't mean like agile with capital A.
Yeah.
Like agility to changes, agility to grow quickly, as opposed to just sort of crumble and break from the fragile command and conquer structure.
Yeah, look, you're still constrained by, we're a people business, right? So you're still constrained by capacity.
Yep.
And any system, even one where you've got decentralized hierarchy, which is what we're talking about, you still have hierarchy in that system. And it's just how decisions are made and how that's governed is different.
Yep.
So you still are constrained by capacity of humans. And that's the rub with financial metrics, right? Because you can't just throw more people because, you got to deliver a profit.
Yep.
So we still had all those problems, but what it did do, rather than personalities dominate how decisions are made, and rather than personalities dominate what decisions are made, it allowed us to really ask the question, which role should be making what decision? And have a governance process that honours that. And I think that's what keeps good teams together, because, I can be a dominant force, I know what I'm like. Part of what makes me good at what I do is that, if I've got an idea, I'll sell it, And if we didn't have a structure in place that held me to account and actually almost dim the lights when it needed to be dimmed, on my ideas, I know it would have been a very different outcome, right?
Yep.
To how we got here today. So the model and structure forced me to have to actually back out of things and just allow other people to, own it and make decisions and run. And that was really important, mate, because the shape of the team, even like you look at a leadership team and how that grows, it allows people to make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes can be significant, but at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that I would have done things any better.
Yeah.
I'm not perfect. So it's a really important feature of, I guess, the governance model of holocracy. And I think now kind of a few years into really adopting it properly, and I say properly because, like I said, when we first launched, we were half in, that didn't work. We broke that pretty quick. We went back to the drawing board, adopted it fully, and there was pain. But I think where we are now, and I look at the efficiency of how decisions are made, how change is adopted incrementally, often, right? Like it's much better, and it makes us much more efficient as a team. And you know what? Like if there are parts of the business I just have no say in, and that's actually not a bad thing, you know. So it just takes a real discipline to get to this point. It's not something that you can get to easily.
It might be a good time to just pause and just walk people through a couple of the practical differences between a distributed decision-making model and holacracy and what you would normally do. I don't know if you want to do that through examples or just...
Yeah. I think you come back to one of the... You have to observe what's the alternative, right? So, you know, in most companies, hierarchy is linear. So what does that mean? It usually means power is linear. So, and in sales training, they train you how to identify that, right? Who's in the political structure? So there's the formal political structure, which is based on an org chart. And then there's the informal, the political structure, which is how decisions are made, right? And that's based on relationships and personalities and, you know, who had success this year, you know, who had success, like who failed, you know, like it's based on a whole bunch of nuance that those power dynamics shift often. And you've seen it where in those type of companies generally, when there's a change in those in the senior levels of those power hierarchies, everything below it changes because, you know, all of a sudden, you know, the power hierarchy has been thrown in the air and someone new comes in and then they change everything because it's better, because they say it's better and, you know, it's not necessarily. And you just see the cards fall and then rebuild and start again, right? And it's just a new version of really what they had, right? Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but you got to recognize it for what it is. What holacracy tries to do is break that apart, yeah? And it does that by, number one, there has to be a hierarchy because any functioning system in nature has a hierarchy, right? It's just a natural design of healthy systems, adaptive systems. But when you distribute the power in that hierarchy, then you have to have things that limit that ability for personalities to dominate, for personalities to, you know, so where it becomes as long as you are closely connected politically to the people, you can get decisions made. You know, if you're doing holacracy right, the most junior person in your company, if they have a good idea, that idea should have a pathway to being assessed, to being tested, and to getting adopted if it's a good idea, regardless of who that person is. And that's powerful, right? Because whilst, you know, there's value in you know, if I want to take the positive view of power hierarchies, when you get smart people get to the top because they're smart, they know how to, you know, they've obviously got results, and it's not always the case, but generally, right? Like they've worked their way there. Therefore, they're good at making big calls, you know, the big strategic calls. But translating those calls to the machinery of the business on a day-to-day, there's a lot of people in the business that can equally make really smart decisions on how that hits, where the rubber hits the road. And unfortunately, that's where those kind of hierarchies fall over, right? Because if you're not close to the right people, you know, you never heard. And that's what holacracy does really well, breaks that apart. It essentially forces you to take away the title of an individual. So example, the title of CEO does not exist in holacracy. It just doesn't exist, yeah? So the question is, well, then what do you do, Frank, right? Well, a good question. Because you actually have to start looking at, well, what is the work that title would normally do? And that could be different, right, in any company, yeah? But it forced us to ask the question, well, what is the work that I need to do? And can we give that work a role, a name? So, you know, so one of those roles is board liaison, you know? So my role, I hold a role which is to basically liaise between the needs of the board and the needs of the business and make sure that the two things work and they marry up and they align. that's my role. That's my responsibility. I have the accountabilities that define, am I doing that role well? And the interesting thing is those accountabilities aren't defined by me. They're actually defined by the people who have an expectation of the role. And that's everyone else but me, right? But the role has a purpose. And as long as an accountability fits the purpose, it gets adopted in governance, right? And when someone in the business feels a tension, which is another key feature of holacracy, a tension is just where they feel that there's something wrong. They feel that things are not working as they should. There's a natural rub tension that needs to get resolved. So that could be, I have an expectation that you as that board liaison communicate to my role things that may impact my role. Mm-hmm. I have an ongoing expectation that you're telling me that. Well, they've got a pathway to actually add that accountability to the role. And then I have to deliver against that accountability, right? And unless there's a good reason that I feel that actually it will have a negative event, and then it's a governance process that actually tests that, and there's a very rigorous process that's very independent. And and I can tell you now, I've lost that battle many times, right? As a CEO, where I lost. And there was, secretaries and facilitators to keep me honest. And that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. And that allows true creativity, right? So creativity, think about it. Creativity is infinite as long as there's a good set of basic initial conditions that are followed, basic rules, yeah? Mm-hmm. When you don't have some basic rules, creativity actually is very difficult because it's chaos, yeah? You think about the old rules of systems, yeah? When there's no order and there's chaos, the system will never orient, will never get creative and adapt. Mm-hmm. So you need some basic rules, and that's what holacracy does. It gives you just some very strong basic rules that within that you can have infinite creativity. Mm-hmm. And that's the good thing. And those rules are not defined by a person. They're defined by the constitution of holacracy. And that's also very important, right? Because I can't change my mind on, how we do that. That is defined. Mm. And regardless of who you are and what title you think you come into the business with. Mm. And that's, I think, very powerful. And that's what allows for the true distribution of decision making, because you look at it from the perspective of what role has what accountabilities and what domains does that role have agency over. Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of roles and responsibilities as they're defined in a traditional company, and I'm hearing differences. Am I right in saying that they're not all hierarchically decomposed? So
absolutely not, yeah.
Which is what they normally are, right? So
correct.
Normally, if I've got a role, I decompose the bits of that thing into the people below me.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like holacracy. I think you've talked about circles. Is that what circles do?
Circles, so... yeah, circles, you can think of a circle as like traditionally from a business unit. Like you might have an operations circle, you might have a product circle, you can design your circles any way you want, right? And the circles are a sub-circle of the main circle, of the kind of core circle. In our business, we call that the nation, 8 Squad Nation, right? And then we've got sub-circles, yeah? Now, the sub-circle has accountabilities defined by the nation and the rest of the circles in the business, right? Now, the circle lead, which is, again, it's not the leader, it's the circle lead, which is a very specific role, has an accountability to make sure that circle delivers against the accountabilities that are set upon it, yeah? Mm-hmm. Now, it may choose to then delegate those accountabilities based on roles that are created in the circle, but that happens based on its governance, its circle governance, yeah? Mm-hmm. So because a circle lead just needs to make sure that the circle is delivering on the purpose and delivering on its accountabilities, yeah? And so a role in holacracy is really about the work being done, and it really forces you to be very clear. What is the actual work being done? So it's not a one-to-one relationship with a soul, right? So one soul can have multiple roles. So it really does force you. So in the old traditional sense, yeah, role was a title, and over time, because a person might choose to take on more things, that role kind of grows, and they end up doing a lot of things that was never in their original JD, but because they're just really good, and so they take on more responsibility, more accountability. In holocracy, you can't do that. You can't do that. So the minute you start taking on more work and that work doesn't fit within the role purpose that you occupy, well, it kind of forces you to think of, is this another role, right? And then so it's very granular in that sense. And it's actually really good because you can actually then start to see actually the work that's being done and who's doing it. So when you got one person kind of occupying 5 roles and you look at the workload, you can clearly see what is being done. And actually, hold on, do we have to bring in another soul here? Because, we can see where the breakdowns are, what actual what work is being done across these roles, which happens to be occupied by this one person or multiple people, because that's the other thing. Multiple people can hold the same role, right? So it's got features like that really force you to get granular in how you organize yourself for the work that has to be done. And whenever there's a tension, which is simply something's not working, it's either a tension because there's a role that doesn't exist. It's either a tension because there's a policy that needs to be put in place, or some clarity on interactions between roles. And that's the governance process. The governance process, which most circles have a governance meeting every 2 to 4 weeks, right? And every governance meeting, something is changed, and then it's adopted, and then it's executed. And that's really the key feature of holocracy.
So in a normal organisation, there's this tension between the team that I'm in for performance measurement versus usually, especially in a consultancy, right, where you're delivering work for clients, you're also in temporary teams to deliver a particular thing. How does that translate into... Are there primary circles and secondary circles, or
that's a great question. So most of our delivery people would sit in a delivery circle. Yeah. So as projects form, obviously, then roles in that circle have to allocate people to work. Yeah. There is no reason why for a long running project that it can't be its own circle, and operate as a circle. And then you can tear it down when that thing's finished, right? We haven't gone to that level yet. But essentially, those teams would operate, as an integrated team, but they're still part of the delivery circle. So if they're experiencing challenges, tensions, they still process that through the governance process in a delivery circle, yeah? But it's interesting because I think as we get better, as more people understand how to play the game, because not every single employee is involved in the holocracy governance process today, yeah? And we've rolled it out circle by circle, yeah? So, that change management process, we didn't want to bombard the organisation. Some people just had to get on and do what they do, and they don't need to know. But the way we've introduced them is when they've come up with ideas or things, that could be changed, we've helped use the process to introduce that change where they can, this is how you do it, right? So play the game, learn the rules, play the game kind of thing, right? I think as we get better, it'd be kind of interesting. And again, is the founding organisation of the method, and we had one of their coaches who worked with us through the implementation. We're now independent, and we just seek advice for them on the tough decisions or the tough things we've got to negotiate with. And it's taken us a kind of just over a year to get there. We chose to do it big circles, main circles, and start to roll it out that way. And that's worked for us. That actually is I wouldn't do it differently. But does that mean if you're another business, would you do it the same way? Well, I don't know. I think if you're small enough, because we got to about 40 or 50 people before we broke that kind of squad model that we had instrumented, which was half in with Holacracy, you know. So we already had 50 people in the business when we started, right? And so we just said, no, let's do this gradually. If we were maybe, 20, we probably could have done it. Holus bolus, like one go, bang, get everyone in. But I think any organisation, there's in Australia there was really no precedent known for us to talk to. I think we're probably one of the first to really go deep. I know others have tried and not necessarily had much success. I know there's a lot of companies in Europe similar size to us who have done very well. And from people that I've spoken to, most have done this incrementally. I know the Zappos story went kind of big bang. I think they were about 300 people when they started that journey. It comes down to just time and money, right? Like if you can get enough support, you can probably do it more aggressively, but you would need a lot of support. Like it is a change management process and you can't underestimate it.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to even implement from scratch something, right?
100%.
Like this training, coaching. So if you're doing it across your whole organisation, even if it's small, all at the same time, because I was going to ask you if there's an overhead, obviously, to managing the system, right?
Yeah.
Or perceived overhead at least. But it sounds like one of the ways you've managed that is to not just do it all at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually the overhead, to be honest, like it's actually more efficient. Like once you get going, once you get that kind of tipping point, it is more efficient and it is easier. And you are, like I look at, these standards for ISO and, quality standards. Hey, you do Holacracy right, you can tick all those boxes because everything is documented, like everything is expressed, everything is clear, like you have to get to that fine level of granularity. And because you're doing iteratively, the overhead's very minimal, What happens with most companies, right, is, they operate and until something's really broken, then they've got to do a big transformation and that's a heavy lifting, you got to break things apart, what's documented, what's not. With this method, because you're doing it constantly and it's just iterative, it's just a lot smoother. So I think once you get going, this actually is a lot more efficient and definitely a lot more robust.
It reminds me of Kanban, actually. When I first tried Kanban and I read an InfoQ thing about, I think it was leave Scrum behind and try Kanban type thing, or Kanban for Scrum Agilist or something. And I remember just the simplicity of the model meant that I could take up the philosophy immediately. Like there was just so few rules. And within 24 to 48 hours, I had made decisions differently based on Kanban.
Yeah.
And this philosophy of limited WIP and, only having a certain number of things in a column. And I was like, oh, we're not supposed to do that. And it was just like the fastest change I've ever seen occur. And it sounds to me like a similar thing.
Yeah. It's the hardest thing I think about adopting these kind of new, whether it be Holacracy or anything else, right? It's such a different way of thinking. And unfortunately, we are all so conditioned to very traditional ways of operating. Mm-hmm. And so you got to break that, and people come in, like we're at a point now where, because we hire people into the business, into roles, and you see the resistance, and now it's like, mate, this is it. There's no question. We don't need to sell this to you. Like we've done this now. We know it works. Like you're either on or you're off, right? And we can be a little bit more aggressive with that, because you just can't. Like there's no halfway. You either do this or you don't. You want to work here? This is how we work.
So you covered that in the interview, I guess.
Yeah, and but people don't know, mate. Like people hear it in an interview and they love the sounds of it until they realise they've got to change how they make decisions and change, like break apart everything they held dear in everywhere else they've ever worked, right? And that takes a bit of time. But by and large, like any system, right? Once you've got, it's like, I always use a story. Anyone who's been to Bali has experienced what it's like when you get thrown into a system that's past the tipping point, right? Like you can go to Bali, you don't have to know the road rules, but you're going to learn them pretty quick, right? Because, yeah, you're right. Because it just, you throw yourself into that chaos, but it looks like chaos from the outside. But there's, some good basic rules that they all follow, and it works, right? And you don't know the rules when you get there, but you get on your little bike, you get on the road, and all of a sudden everyone's beeping and everyone's moving this way, and you realize actually there's no lights or no one listens, and you learn pretty quick, right? Because you've got feedback loops. Mm-hmm. Yeah, feedback loops of people screaming at you, feedback loops of bikes beeping at you.
Hospital.
So you learn pretty fast, and it just took us time to get to that point where you can throw someone in that system, and there's at least enough feedback loops for them to learn while doing. And as we get bigger and as we kind of get now past that tipping point threshold, I think it'll become a lot easier when we're throwing people into that system, because they'll learn through osmosis. It won't be such an effort. But it's hard. You got to get to that point.
I think. No.
Yeah, just sorry. I got so many questions. So, is there a training role for newcomers,
Yeah.
or is it literally just feedback?
No. So we now have in our people and culture circle, we have a holocracy coach and holocracy onboarding role. So we have a team of people who help new employees in, and potentially anyone spinning up a new circle in the process of doing that, So we now have internal capability to kind of coach people through that journey.
Interesting. I had one other leftover question from before. So I think what you're saying is that the roles, part of my brain is going, like my little data modeling brain is going, are all roles defined in the context of at least one circle, or are those things separate? Circles and roles, you can have a role that doesn't relate, isn't necessarily linked to a circle.
Well, it's always going to be in a circle, whether it's in an 8 squad nation, the super circle, or whether it's in one of the sub circles, because a role and a circle essentially kind of the same thing,
they're
right?
tightly linked,
yeah. So it's always going to exist somewhere. It can't sit outside of the core, at least the anchor circle.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Sorry, it's just making me think about, you said 8 squad then. Does it make you think that you should change it to 8 holo? Has that come up rather than the attachment to squad?
No, you know what? I still like it's interesting because I've been asked that, right? We still like the fact, the idea, right, that there is a natural number when you look at grouping of people, and when you start to break that number, quality of outcome starts to erode because, just feedback loops, right? And you could have called it 7 squad, could have called it 9 squad, but 8 sounded good, and it was infinite and a whole lot of things, right?
But it's lucky.
Right, and it was a bit lucky, right? So exactly, it's certainly in Asia, it's going to be a very lucky number. So
you're not going to be behind the 8 ball.
No, like that. I'm going to use that. The essence of keeping teams small, nimble, right? Like, and looking at the distribution of like leadership, so that your most junior people are never too far away from good senior leaders, right? And that still rings very true in this business. And when a circle gets too big, right, it's forcing you to go, well, okay, do we need to start looking at sub-circles? We need to break it down. We need to break it out, right? So those founding principles of 8 squad, of nimble teams, like special forces, right, still absolutely rings true. And holocracy supports that. It's not an opposing philosophy.
It's interesting, actually, the special forces comparison, because I think a lot of people don't appreciate that the special forces in each of the defence forces and then the combined one, like the Delta Force in the US, are specifically different from the normal command and conquer, right? So they are the practices of distributed decision making, making decisions at the point closest to where the information exists.
They have to be.
And multi-skilled as well, right? Yeah. So, they all learn multiple skills. They don't just shoot or even snipers, right? They have a bunch of other skills that they bring to the team.
I find it's a feeling as opposed to an academic thing, viscerally very attractive. Something in me goes, I got that. Cognitively, I find it terrifying. And there's a lot of questions I have around behaviours and where I've seen, you guys were both exploring it a minute ago, people are attracted to autonomy, an ecosystem of autonomy, the pursuit of mastery autonomy and pushing the damn pink stuff. But once they have it, they don't know what to do with it.
Absolutely.
It's chaos. There's a thought there, but I need to go to a second question, and you can pick your order you want to answer. It reminds me of systems that are designed to empower large groups, political systems, large groups of people, and the long arc of those systems is they're ultimately corrupted, and so. But the military is a really good counterexample of where it's evolved and probably won't be corrupted. That autonomy will be preserved. You can imagine in Delta teams. So what distinctions do you think are drawn between the military systems that will endure beyond this, and then the political systems which are unfortunately doomed for corruption? Those that espouse cooperation and representation of bigger groups. And I'm talking about socialism, communism, and those type of things, right? I mean, so there's a lot in that. So do you have to accept that this is a golden era and ultimately the long arc is doomed to failure because these types of systems have always struggled? Or are you going to implement militaristic type controls to make sure that doesn't?
So, interesting. So, again, because the controls of the system are fundamentally governed by the holocracy constitution. They're the rules. And you can't change that. You can use those rules to make decisions. And if political systems actually work this way, they'd work.
Okay.
Yeah? The reason they don't is because political systems are driven by a voting dynamic. And that's why they're corrupted. Yeah? And they're not held they're not held to the governance process, right? That's what we see. But this, popularity doesn't matter in holocracy. That's the difference with a political system, yeah? I can be popular. It doesn't give me any more authority to make decisions based on what I have authority to make based on the roles I occupy. Simple as that. And we're all held and governed by that constitution, yeah? And there's enough checks and balances in that system to keep that honest, right? If I tried to corrupt that, we wouldn't be practicing holocracy. Simple as that. As a CEO, that title, I only have two decisions I can make when it relates to holocracy. I either adopt the constitution and run by those rules, or I don't, right? So if the organisation calls bullshit, right, because, I'm conveniently using it, well, then that's it. We just rip out holocracy and, go back to a traditional way of working. So come back, because there was so many levels to your question. I think it's different to a political system, even though it kind of sounds kind of like it. But I honestly, if this to me is actually how political systems should be run, right?
Feels that way.
Yeah. When you think about military systems, right, the reason why these special forces units work, because they still, again, like holocracy, I think it actually marries really well, right? You still have some fundamental rules you can't breach. But at the end of the day, once you're behind enemy lines, you have to have full tactical control of the decisions you make, right? You have to, because you can't pick up the phone and call someone, right? Because there's op risk if you do that. And so the way in which you make decisions, the way in which you operate have to be very well defined. And people have to have, I think of, whether it be the SEALs or Delta or these special force units, people are very clear on what their role is, right? And the accountabilities are because your life depends on it, right? And that's why it works. And whilst in holacracy your life doesn't depend on it, it actually it follows those same principles. Like you'll get questioned. No. What is your responsibility, accountability? You know, if there's grey, well, let's define the grey. You know, there cannot be any grey, right? And here's the process we use to define the grey. And so I think there's actually a lot of compatibility, right? When I think of kind of how that kind of has special forces process works and how holacracy kind of works. And yeah, I think it's a superior system. Look, you know, if I come back to my days in the sciences, especially you know, complex adaptive systems have certain features, right? And that's, if you look at any system in nature, it's essentially a complex adaptive system, and nature has infinite creativity, but within some very basic rules, right? That just don't change. You know, you can believe, you know, the law of, you know, gravity exists or not. Jump off something, you're going to learn pretty quick that it exists, right? You know, and that's how you got to treat some of these basic initial conditions, right? They can't be breakable, and that's when systems can adapt. And so I think the hardest thing is making sure that, you know, it's not holacracy that will fail or succeed. It's the people that implement it and stay true to it, or, you know, and stay disciplined. You know, it's a tool. And that's the other thing, you know, it's not the golden panacea, it's a tool. And like any tool, it can be corrupted, it can be misused, right? But if you're using the tool in the manner in which it's designed, it works.
How many generations does it need to pass through before it takes a life on of its own? Because you can say, actually, I'll come back. I was reading about the formation of special military units recently under Wellington, and the premise of these things were it was intelligence first, rule breaking, competence. These people are off the streets. They were killers from London, basically, or Ireland, or Scotland, and Wales. So there was lots of Celts. And then the weapons that they had to enable them. So intelligence, rule breaking, the capability to be ruthless, and the weapons that they were equipped with. But this is 200 years ago. You're talking about 1803, 1804. That was when it began. So it's embedded. It's now the way that these units work. And obviously there's probably different markers of it. I'm no expert in this stuff. So how many generations do you need for it to survive? Because what I heard you say a minute ago is if you could stop breaking the rules and corrupting it, therefore it's on you. The moment it loses your sponsorship, it's on you. Yeah. So how are you going to make it a dynasty, not a whim?
Yeah, that's a great question. So make it bigger than me,
beyond you,
right? So in any system, right? They're attractors of that system, yeah. And when enough of those attractors, yeah. So I think from a holacracy perspective, when I have the entire leadership just as bought in as me, just as committed as me, then take me out of the picture. It's not going to matter, because you put anyone else in, even to take on the roles I was doing, who try and then manipulate that system, they're going to be held to account pretty quick. And two things will happen. Either they win and whoever's my replacement falls in line, or that person wins and holacracy gets thrown out the door, which is the only decision that person can make. And maybe that person loses their key leadership. Okay, fine. But that's so how far do we have to go for holacracy to survive at 8 squad? That's a good question. I don't know. I know while this team's in place, I'm now confident even I can be plucked out, and there's enough people there that now understand the value, now have gotten into that operating rhythm that it'll survive without me. But that doesn't guarantee anything.
Yeah, one of the reasons I was asking at the beginning the question of, introduce 8 squad and what it is, and the fact that you've got investors and whatever, is there's a future where that organisation becomes part of another organisation. I think having been through that process recently myself, it's I would imagine it's quite difficult if you're subsumed into another organisation. It's quite difficult to retain that because the culture of the other thing will.
Well, you can do two things, right? You can just, depending on who buys you, right? They can keep you as an operating unit. You can have a bridge between this system and another system, just like any. So you can essentially still form part of a more linear power hierarchy, but still retain the integrity of that unit. That's one option. Or you can infiltrate, right, and slowly grow that system out and consume the main system. Look, I think the kind of people that would want to acquire us would be interested and intrigued about the way we operate. And so I think that's an opportunity for us to prove it out and scale it beyond our walls. And I think that's very real, and that's what I'm hoping for. If we have another chat, maybe in a few years, we'll see how that goes, right? But yeah, look, that's what. Yeah, you're right. But there are definitely pathways for it to survive and exist.
Do you know if there's any case studies where that's?
No, actually, that's a really good question. I don't. You read things in the press around Zappos's journey, and I think a lot of it is misreported. They were bought by Amazon, right? Were kept very independent. How that went there, I don't know. They'd probably be the biggest in terms of size. There are a number of companies in Europe that I know have gone on this journey. Yeah, I don't know. I'd actually, it's a good question to ask. I'd probably go back to the guys at Holacracy one and ask the question.
Cool. And I guess we've got to wrap up at some point. But for me, there's a logical future, right? For someone who's worked in this model, it's like, is it a case for you of I'm only going to be in organisations that use this model moving forward, do you think? Or would you go back to a traditional model?
No, I don't think I could go back to a traditional model.
So, as in moving on to new companies in the future or creating new companies, you'd always use this model?
I think so. Well, if it's me, yeah. If I'm in a driving seat, 100%. I'd like to, as a I think a personal goal, show that this can scale to 500 people, can scale through an acquisition. I think that's I'd like to prove that, and talk about that journey. I think that'll be interesting. And we might get there.
You can imagine. So I've been witness to a company that had a very specific culture. It wasn't structured under the Holacracy banner because I was just not aware of it. A team of 30 people gets subsumed, and 2 years later, not a single person was left.
Yeah, mate, that happens all the time. Most acquisitions.
But I think that's the type of danger of someone buying this and not appreciating how bought in people are to the model, because in any company that gets bought, there's a natural attrition rate, but 100% is pretty unusual. And I think that if people love autonomy and love distributed decision making and enjoy it and are relaxed and happy and all the damn pink stuff, motivated, it's more noticeable when it goes away.
Yeah, and I think that's why you need to prove it out at scale. 30 people, very easy just to absorb, and no, you slot in here now, right? 100 people, not so much. And that's why I think the bigger we get and the more we show the value at scale, the harder it is to stop that momentum. And that's the goal.
Nice. I actually think that there's emergent thinking in leadership, an awareness around people and systems and method. And I was doing some research on holocracy for today, and one of the complaints of this, she seemed very good. One of her observations is actually one of your strengths, funnily enough. Her observations of the weaknesses of holacracy is one of your strengths. And she said it was about complex adaptive systems in nature, and holacracy, in her view, wasn't catering for that to the extent that she expected. And it's so funny that you talk about complex adaptive systems and deterministic chaos, which is something not today, but you've spoken to him about in the past. And it's interesting maybe that you're a point, not only are you a point in time in the market where there's emergent behaviour, but also you're uniquely positioned to do just as you've said, because of some of those other adventures that we haven't talked about today. I think it's fascinating because as I was hearing her complaints, I was smiling about your personal attributes and thinking, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
There's a whole load more questions I have from the research I did, but to try and understand what we might talk about, because it's not my interview, it's just here to be the eye candy. So I should let you wrap up, Andrew.
Yeah, great. So my final question is there stuff that you'd want to share with, I guess from two perspectives. One is someone who, does research in this and goes, I would really love to do this I'd really love this to happen in my organisation, but I'm not the CEO. And then the second one would be for someone starting their own business, advice, like where to go first, what to do, learning from your own experiences to shortcut.
Yeah, so firstly, don't do it alone. You're going to fail. The guys at Holacracy One, it was absolutely imperative to have their support, right? And so you have to invest in the early education of yourself, but then the support, because those first 6 months are tough, right? And you need that person to help you. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, you can be a small business unit within a greater nested system, and adopt this, right? That's okay. And, but you're going to need an organisation that's really going to support that journey, right? And at least, even they may not participate directly, they need to buy into the fundamental premise of, what you're going to be running by and how that then interacts with the main system, right? So definitely, I think that's possible for those people who are curious and really want to go, but you're going to need the right organisation to support you.
Have you seen anything that's particularly convincing that a more junior person in an organisation could use as a sales tool, like videos from Holacracy One that sell the idea as opposed to just explain the idea?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I haven't kind of looked at that for a while, because we kind of bought into this a while back.
No is a valid answer. It's fine.
Yeah, no, I don't know. There's definitely some really great content that they've got up on their, I think, YouTube channels and Facebook channels. There's some really good content there, especially even the basic stuff on, how they run tactical meetings and how they run governance meetings, which are tools, right? Yeah. So I think that's probably a good place to start, and then go from there.
Or listen to the first part of this podcast.
Or listen to the podcast.
Explaining why it's good. Or just get you in.
There you go.
You can sell the idea to the board, yeah.
I come cheap. It's all good.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, guys.
I think we absolutely will get you back at a point in time when you think it's useful to draw some parallels.
Might be sooner than we think. You never know.